Welcome to Required Reading's Top 100.
Today we're going to be knocking off two more books on our top 100 list. It'll be one from each of our top 50. What book do you have today?
So this week I actually have something a little bit different from last week. I'm going to be talking about Stephen King's The Stand. So yes, this is one of my top 50 books. It's a book that I first read when I was a teenager in high school, and I remember very specifically I bought this book at a Walden Books near my school, and it pretty much cost me my entire week's salary for that week. It was I was working as a tutor in my high school, getting just a small salary for tutoring for about an hour a day. And I went to the bookstore and I saw this book by Stephen King called The Stand. The difference with that book versus the original publication, which came out sometime in the 70s, was that this version of The Stand was totally unabridged. And I read the first chapter and it just totally captivated me. And so I bought the book.
Wait, you read the first chapter in the store before you even bought it?
I did, yeah. And I mean, the first chapter is actually quite short, and it doesn't appear in the original abridged publication of the book. The opening chapter is essentially what happens at the very start of a plague. So The Stand, The Stand at its very, very basis is a book about good and evil. But it's also a book about the plague, or a plague, and a government plague. So a plague is released upon the land. It occurs because the government has been developing plagues, and this is a theme that appears in Stephen King's books. You have things released by the government, experiments by the government, whether it's things regarding mind control or things regarding plagues or other sort of disasters. And this is something that is quite common in the Stephen King multiverse. This plague gets released into the world and kills off 99.7% of the population. It's the first plague book I've ever read. I've since read a couple of other plagues, one of which is Albert Camus' The Plague. La Peste is one of the most famous books about a plague. There's a few others that I've read since, but this was the first one. And as a concept, it wasn't really something that I was that aware of. I suppose maybe there were movies about plagues at the time, but this was the first one. It's a very long book. It's over 1,000 pages, and it's almost in two parts. So you can think of it as taking place in two parts. The first part is what happens when this plague gets released, and how do people react to the plague, and how the plague moves from person to person. The second half of the book is the one where you have more of this battle between good and evil. You essentially have a group of people who coalesce in a town, in this case Boulder, Colorado, and they're sort of the good guys. And they're brought there by this figure, this ancient woman who's over 100 years old, who's sort of the embodiment of good. And a large number of people coalesce in Las Vegas around this character named Randall Flagg, who's sort of the embodiment of evil. And it's essentially a war between the two of them. It's a war between good and evil. Randall Flagg is a character, it's a very interesting character. If you know anything about Stephen King and the sort of Stephen King multiverse, you know that Randall Flagg is a figure that appears across all his books. And it's suggested that this is sort of an ancient figure of evil. And he was there during the crucifixion. And he's there during the Black Plague of about 1,000 years ago. So he's there at a time of great upheaval. And so he's a very common character. But at the very core of the book is essentially a battle between good and evil. And also what happens when government runs amok, what happens when people do stupid things, what happens when society collapses and then tries to rebuild itself. And that's what the core idea of the book is. This is a book that maybe might not appear in your typical sort of like required reading or reading list. Stephen King is an author that kind of goes in and out of style in many ways, goes in and out of style for the literary sect. So a lot of people don't consider him to be particularly literary, perhaps. But then there are moments where people are like, well, no, actually, he is a really good writer. And then there are other times or other groups of people who just dismiss him as a genre writer, as a person who simply writes horror books. But his oeuvre, if you will, actually is quite broad. And he writes a little bit about fantasy. He writes quite a lot about horror. He also does a great job about writing about friendship, especially childhood friendship. This book doesn't have childhood friendship so much as it has adult friendship. And he does a really great job of that, how people relate to each other. He's really good at getting into under people's skin and writing about characters. And so I think it's a really wonderful book because it embodies a lot of different things that make literature truly great. And it also tackles really large themes in a genre book. I don't know that I would say this is horror exactly, but it can be sort of considered that. It can also be considered epic in a way because it is an epic book. It may be one of the few books about plague or the plague or a plague that can be considered epic. And in that sense, he is sort of bringing together a bunch of different genres and tackling really huge themes about humanity. So this is my recommendation, Stephen King's The Stand. I think it's a wonderful book. I think it's a book that keeps offering a lot of new insight, and it's my recommendation for this week. So what's your top 50 for this week?
So my top 50 is a book that I read first off in college. I was in a Scandinavian children's literature class, and we read Sophie's World by Jostein Gaarder. I loved this book, and this is the copy that I read when I was in college, and there's lots and lots of underlines, and it's really interesting to go back and see what I did underline back then, what I was interested in. But Sophie's World it's actually hard for me to put it on either a fiction list or a nonfiction list, because I think it might be the only book that I've ever read that straddles both worlds, in that it does have a fiction story, and the main character's name is Sophie, and she is an 11-year-old girl. But then within each chapter, there are these philosophical lessons that she is being taught by. She refers to it as like a correspondence course because she didn't sign up for it or anything, but like weird letters just start showing up in her mailbox, and she's learning all of these things. She's learning about Socrates and Aristotle, and then it progresses throughout the history of philosophy itself. So again, it's that story, it's that fiction story, but then all of the information that she is being taught is then nonfiction, because it really is like we're learning about Socrates, we're learning who Aristotle is, we're learning about who Kierkegaard is, and there's Hume here, and there is Descartes. It really is the gamut of philosophers in there. And it was just like I had no pre-knowledge of philosophy. I had no desire to learn about philosophy either. So it was really interesting that I found this book very, very captivating in that it did have that story, but then it did like teach me things every chapter, and to learn about philosophy in this type of way was really digestible and approachable. Now, that could be that I was reading it in college and it is written for like 14-year-olds. So it was easily, again, digestible and understandable. And it was just so magical in that first read through that it has always stuck with me. I found it also very helpful when I was studying in Norway and I was taking this one history of aesthetics class, and it was the only class that I ever got a B in. And yes, grading in Norway is intense. So it was the only class that I ever got a B in because I really actually knew it because of this book. I knew the history of like the philosophy behind beauty and all of those things. So I have Jostein Gaarder to thank for that B in my undergrad class. The second undergrad class that I was just mentioning. And then I recently actually started to reread it. So this is the 20th anniversary edition. And it is just as magical actually reading it 20 years later. And I found it really interesting that, I think that I've grown up so much and I've learned so much throughout life, and, but I'm still actually underlining the exact same things that I underlined in the first time through. So I had a little chuckle on that one, but it's definitely, it might even be number one on my top 50 list. I know that we're not doing these in order or anything. It's just books that are on our top 50, but this actually might be my number one favorite book ever. Yeah.
That's cool. Okay.
All right. Now it is time for our hot seat question. Again, these are questions that neither one of us know about prior. We're just thinking of them as we're listening to the other person talk about their book. My hot seat question for you this week is, you bought this when you were 14 years old, and it captivated you when you read the first chapter in the bookstore before even buying it. From the perspective of a 14-year-old, what exactly did you find about this book so intriguing? Because the themes that it covers are so much larger, I think, than a 14-year-old's brain. And not saying your 14-year-old brain, but like 14-year-old brains in general. I mean, plagues and governments, and it's just, it's very big and very robust, and I would say maybe too hard for a 14-year-old to kind of comprehend. So what was it about the book as a 14-year-old? So putting yourself back in that mindset of that first time that you read the chapter, what really captivated you? Again, it could be just so scary, really.
Yeah, I recently, just like you with Sophie's World, I've just recently reread The Stand all the way through. And it really, I want to say it's the third time I've read it. Actually, I'm pretty certain that it is the third time I've read this book. And it really has held up. But what I noticed about it was the way that it really informed the way that I lived my life and the way that I thought of the world. And so I think as a 14-year-old boy, you're often looking for heroes. And now heroes can sort of be, I think a lot of kids, probably like boys especially, might look at like athletes as heroes. Or maybe if you're a certain age, you might look at certain comic book characters as heroes. And I think I was kind of coming out of the comic book character. So it was no longer Superman or Spider-Man. I think I was old enough to sort of look for heroes that were sort of just normal human beings, maybe. And this book is sort of full of them. There's a couple of characters in this book that I thought, in that world, that's who I want to be like. There's a character called Stu Redman, who's from East Texas in this book. And of course, I'm from New York City, so the East Texas thing was very foreign to me. But he was sort of this person who was quiet. I'm not very quiet, but who's quiet and very thoughtful and often does the right thing when it needs to be done. Not because he's super smart or anything like that. It's just part of his character. He sort of does the right thing at the right time. There's another character called Larry Underwood who starts out the book as a junkie. But he sort of goes through this transformation, and the plague brings on this transformation. He's sort of forced into it. And then he adapts and really becomes a person that people can look up to. And so these figures, these men in this book sort of created models that I can follow. I didn't really have a lot of like a father figure in my life, a very direct father figure in my life. And so the characters in this book sort of provided that. And I think rereading the book now, I think that they're quite positive in many ways, because they're flawed characters, and those are just two of them. There's a few others. They're very flawed characters, and they're maybe not the smartest. They don't seem to be the most heroic. They're maybe not even really the bravest per se, but there's something about the moment to which they rise to the moment. And a lot of and Stephen King's characters, I think a lot of them sort of do that for me. His books do a really good job. And in some ways, a lot of his books are a little bit of coming of age stories, even though they're not often classified in that way. And either you learn something about yourself from these characters. I certainly did. I thought, yeah, I want to be like this character. And so that was something that I really related to. And then rereading it recently, even though now I'm an adult and it's very different, I can still see that. I can still feel that about these characters. So that's the thing for me. Okay, my hot seat question for you is: we've both taken philosophy classes in college. I remember you. Yeah,
I dropped mine.
Okay, you
I
dropped
never
yours.
completed it.
But so you took philosophy. You took a philosophy course in college. I did as well, and you have also in your graduate program. Would you say, based on that, especially the college course that you took, that Sophie's World can act as a reasonable replacement for a college level class, introductory class on philosophy? Or do you still think you're better off taking the actual course at college?
Mm-hmm. Well, first off, the class that I took in college that I got that B in was an art history class. Mm-hmm. It was the history of aesthetics. So the only philosophy class that I registered for in college, I dropped and I didn't finish. But okay. I think that this book should be part of the curriculum of a introductory college philosophy class. I do not think that it should be the basis of the class, but I do think that it is a great jumping off point to start conversations, to be able to access the primary resources. So if you read the chapter on Descartes and then you actually read one of Descartes' writings, I think that could work very well in parallel and be able to dive in a little bit deeper, rather than sort of trying to dive in deep when you don't quite understand the foundation of it is a lot harder. And maybe you don't get a full, robust understanding of the topic or the conversation, or the concept that particular philosopher is trying to explain. So I don't think that it's a substitute, but I do think that it should be on the pensum or on the reading list as a requirement to really create perhaps a more solid foundation. Now, all of that to say that I did not grow up in the education system of Norwegian kids, and maybe they did get this in like high school or junior high or anything. I did not. So I think it might be good for the more North American school system, but I actually think that the European school system, seeing as I really don't know what grade 1 through 12 consists of, I can't really say for that. So if you are in university in the North American system, I do think that this would be a well received addition to the reading list, but not a substitute.
Not a substitute. Okay.
Thanks for joining us this week for Required Readings Top 100. If you have any opinions about these two books, Sophie's World or The Stand, or you actually want to add a book in the comments below that is a book that is on your top 50 or your top 100, we would love to hear all about them.
We'll be back next week with Required Readings Top 100.